right, we're back with the fabulous Ron Kozlowski and Caleb Kenyon from Turner O'Connor Kozlowski. That's a lot of words, but we're Ron and Caleb, thanks for being on True Law Stories.
Hey, of course.
And I've been working with the guys over here at Turner O'Connor Kozlowski, and we've been talking about a recent case they had defending someone against the federal government. I think this is a super interesting case. We've had several of these types of cases on where federal criminal defense attorneys are defending people that were wrongfully accused. Now, and we were talking about the show, not every person is wrongfully accused. There's just mitigation, but this one was a wrongful accusation case. But before we get into that, what's the difference between a federal case and a state case from a legal standpoint, from like the legal mechanics standpoint?
Well, the federal court is just a completely different animal in so many respects from state court. State court can be a lot more seat of your pants. The rules are much more loose. The structure is looser. It's just not as rigid in state court. Federal court, judges try to set out a timetable early. You have to actually abide by all the deadlines. Everything you want to do in a federal case, you're asking the court's permission. It's just very, very structured, very complex, and very detailed, which is why a lot of the reason why they take a long time and they're very expensive to defend, which in white collar cases, that's one of the primary issues for people is even when they're wrongly accused, like what we're going to talk about, it's just a life-changing event because of that.
And some of the people in this, as we'll talk about too, couldn't afford it or chose not to afford this type of defense and ended up just pleading out and ended up going to jail, didn't they?
They did. And, what their reasons were, we can't say. We weren't their lawyers, but certainly they had some of the same defenses available to them that we had. We just had a client who was lucky enough to have the resources to dig as deep as we needed to dig and turn over enough rocks where we could find the path to, in this case, convincing a jury that he was not guilty.
And so when you all see, like, let's just talk about this case. So Greg Carter, let's talk about the case overall, because it was a long case.
It was, and Caleb's the best one to talk about how long it was, because he remembers clearly that when he joined us as a law student, it was one of the first things he worked on.
Yeah, I joined the firm in March of 2015 during my first year of law school, and Greg Carter came in our door 2 months later in May. So I had just finished my first year of law school, and we wrapped up the case. What was it, 6.5 years later?
Wow, that's a long time to I can't imagine that, because it's like have that weighing over your head, right? I mean, having a child, it's 9 months, right? It feels like forever. Have the federal government looking at you for 6.5 years and not knowing what's going to happen. And when Greg first came to you and you see it's a federal case and it's a healthcare case, what's your initial reaction when not just when he first came to you, but like you get this type of federal case?
Well, the first thing you have to do really is make sure that you have the capacity and the deck is clear enough to take on a case like this, because we knew right up front that this is going to be a long-term thing, and it was going to be a lot of work, a lot of hours spent doing it. So one of the first things you do is you look at it and you say, are we in a place right now where we can handle this kind of a case? We were in this situation. And then the first thing you do is debrief the client, learn as much as you can, try to talk to the government agents, lawyer, whoever happens to be involved at that point. And then what you do is you start your own investigation. The defense team starts at a huge disadvantage, because you get involved in something like this with the client coming to you because he's at his office one day, which is across the street from his family pharmacy, federal agents show up with a box truck and they say, we have a warrant, and they just turn the place upside down, question all these employees, take telephones, documents, computers. And you say, well, where's this even coming from? You don't know how long they've been investigating. You don't know exactly what they're investigating. So our first job is to try to find out what this is about, and then start our own investigation to try to, at the outset, to try to catch up with the government, which is exactly what we did here.
There's two big questions that you have to answer quickly: is who did what and who knew about what? And when you got a federal case, those are the two big things that you really have to dive in, because almost certainly, and especially with a white collar case, there's just going to be a whole lot of moving parts, a whole lot of different people. So figuring out the diagram chart of where everyone fits in is pretty critical early on.
And how many people were involved in that diagram chart that you're talking about?
I think we had about 100 employees at the pharmacy at the peak time, right when the feds came and raided it.
Wow. So do you have to investigate every single person? Do you have to know every single person that's there?
Not every single person, but once you look into the key people, and then it sort of branches out from there, and you get a good sense of who knows something, who doesn't know something, and who can be helpful in revealing the truths. Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the truths, right? We get an idea of what the government thinks, and then we're trying to find out, okay, what's the truth? And sometimes the truth is helpful. Sometimes it's good for the defense. Sometimes it's not. But we can only do the job as well as we can if we know what the truths are. So you figure out, in that case, we probably interviewed 25 people overall. I think that's a fairly good number, who were employees or otherwise involved with in-depth interviews, and then plenty of others we just sort of touched base with, and those people we interviewed kept up with many of them over the course of the 5.5 years that we were investigating the case before trial.
Wow, 5.5 years. And between the warrants and the federal government coming in and there actually being an arrest, how long was that space?
4.5 years.
Wow. 4.5 years of just sitting there going, is this going to happen? Is this going to happen? Was there any point where like, oh, maybe this isn't going to happen, that he's not going to get arrested?
Wishful thinking. And yes, we suffer from wishful thinking sometimes, but that's the thing, is the government never comes out and says, okay, we've closed our investigation, we found nothing wrong here. That doesn't happen. So you really have to wait for a statute of limitations to run before you can be sure. And so sure, there were times, I think, where we thought, well, maybe this is just going to be dropped. But as soon as you start thinking that, there's some indication that it's not going to be dropped, that they're still looking. And here's the thing, and this is, I think, what leads to prosecutions when a person is innocent. And remember, in this case, there were several defendants, 4 defendants at a trial, and I know our client was innocent, but when you look at the big picture, which we probably can talk about, certainly some things appeared to be improper. Mm-hmm. But the question is, like Caleb said, who knew what and who did what. So, but I think what happens is once the government, the agents, get a hold of something and they start learning things, they get to a point where they're so invested in it that if there's enough smoke, they keep going, and then if they find fire, they try to branch out. And then at some point, it's almost like there's a point of no return, where they can't go back and say, you know what, we were wrong about this, because they've convinced them. I'm not saying it's because they have bad intentions or bad motives. They just get to a point where they become convinced that every close call goes against our client, that every time there's a close call, they view it as, well, yep, that's a close call, but it indicates to me that this person is guilty of something. So they get so invested in it that they can't really go backwards and say, never mind, we were wrong.
Can you divulge an example of that in this case?
So, there were, I'm trying to think of an example, and Caleb can jump in if there's something I'm not thinking of. But when you take relatively small facts that we had, for instance, we had a spreadsheet that we called good faith, because what we were trying to show is that our client, Greg Carter, did everything he could properly. And he was trying to play by the rules and trying to make sure that his employees didn't do anything wrong. So we had this list of things, and they could have been an email or a text message or a fact about some training they provided. And our take on it is, right, that shows the good faith of Greg, that he was trying to do it right. If you step aside and look at it on the flip side, you might have a government agent who says, well, right, he did that because he was trying to cover up the fact that he knew he was breaking the law, and that's why he did this training. It was just a sham to make it look like he was trying. And there's all these little things that sort of thing happens. We have to look at it from both sides.
Yeah, what we really saw happen here is whatever preconceived notion you have of the case affects the way you view any close call. And this was a type of case where there was definitely illegal behavior going on, like Ron said. It was, some low-level people in Greg's organization were breaking the law, and there was a whole lot of money that was being made, most of it legitimately. But when the agents took those two factors together and they said, we know some people are breaking the law, and we know the person that's getting rich from it is Greg Carter because he owns this corporation, this has to be a fraud. So they started from that place. So they had a presumption of fraud in everything that they looked at, which is kind of the antithesis of our legal system, where you're supposed to be presumed innocent. But as it often goes in an investigation like this, when everything's presumed fraud, that innocent explanation turns into a cover-up. And like Ron said, that's exactly what they said over and over and over again.
Well, I just want to clarify what the charges ended up being. What they were, and did you know those were going to be the charges?
We did not know what the charges were going to be until the indictment came down. It was a conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud, and then it was a payment of a kickback to solicit a service covered by a healthcare plan, and then money laundering, which is just basically taking money that's illegally gained and depositing it in the bank.
And so all in all, if everything went bad and top level, what kind of punishment was Greg looking at for that?
I think his guidelines were at about 28 years, if I recall correctly. So it would have basically been a life sentence.
Life sentence, yeah. So Ron, you were going to say something about the cover-up piece of it then?
No, it wasn't so much about the cover-up piece. It was something Caleb hit on, though, about the money. And it's really something that informed us from the very beginning of this case all the way through trial. And it became a theme at trial, which is that when there's so much money involved, and I know we haven't yet talked about how much, but when you're talking about tens of millions of dollars going into, coming out of a government healthcare plan, insurance, essentially, going to private people to pay for prescriptions in this case, it does a couple things. It raises all kinds of suspicions in the government investigators, because they say, well, there's this much money, they're earning this much money, there's got to be something illegal about how they're doing it. The other thing it does is, because of the way the healthcare system is structured, there's always places in there, sort of like the tax system, where people can find ways to use it to their advantage and make a lot of money. So not only does it raise suspicions among government investigators, it also is just sitting out there tempting for people to take advantage of. And even though they could make a lot of money legally, people don't stop there. They find ways to do it illegally too. So that money piece was just huge from the beginning.
So, you get these federal charges, and you know that, I mean, whether it's, and I think this is an interesting discussion, whether it's intentional or not, that the feds don't stop once they get going. What did you feel the chances at when the charges first came through that you're going to walk away scot-free were? Well, Greg was.
I don't know, Caleb, what did we tell Greg the odds were of not being convicted?
I honestly don't remember.
It's somewhere around 2% in the federal system. If charges are brought, it's somewhere around 2% of people who don't get convicted, because generally they bring charges against low-hanging fruit, right? It's people that have to plead guilty. Very few go to trial, and in trials, hardly anybody's acquitted. It's just a rare thing. Now, what's interesting about Greg Carter in this case is that he was easily the most optimistic person on the team. He told us from the day he walked into our office that he didn't do anything wrong. And he told us all the way through to the verdict, see, I told you so. I knew this would work out okay. And we said, well, we're really happy you did, Greg, because you were right. But we we're defense lawyers. We can never be that confident. We live it every day. So
yeah, I'm sure you've seen people that you were judged were 100% innocent, and they knew they were innocent and still went to jail, right? And that's happened before, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And
if you think there's no wrongfully convicted people in prison right now, then take a look at the Innocence Project.
Yeah. And it's even more so, like, the federal government decides they're going in one direction. It's like you're saying, it's kind of like a runaway train, not in necessarily a bad sense, but they're not stopping it. There's no one turning around and the federal's going, oh, I made a mistake.
And that's actually something that really became obvious in this case once we got to trial. You talked about what our thoughts were when the indictment first came down. The reality was, actually, when the indictment first came down, it didn't make sense to any of us, because we didn't really understand what they believed Greg Carter had done that was illegal. You read through this whole thing, and it was, I don't know, maybe 20 pages of an indictment. And the factual allegations against Greg Carter were that he was in a conspiracy, he owned and operated a pharmacy, he gave money to somebody else, and then he put money that he earned from his business in his bank account.
And we said, okay, sounds like that's things people do every day. I don't know what's illegal about any of that.
And he used that money to buy something.
He didn't even have to do that.
Yeah, they didn't really even allege that. Well, I guess they alleged that he bought his house with money that he illegally earned. But yeah, worked out in the end. But that whole thing about the money was really so critical to the entire case, because when people see that much money, whether it be an investigator, a judge, or a jury, it raises all sorts of suspicions and thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. And so, okay, now you're getting into the case. Tell me about preparing for trial, because I mean, if Greg's that innocent, it feels that innocent, was he taking the preparation seriously?
Oh, absolutely. He was a full participant in his defense. There's no question about it. But one of the first things we had to do, this is an allegation of healthcare fraud based on kickbacks in the pharmacy arena. So the first thing we really had to do was understand how the ins and outs of the way these prescriptions were generated, the way they were filled, and the way they were paid for, reimbursed by insurance companies. And to get into that a little bit, the system is set up for this. These were compound medications, and people may have heard about compound medications and various fraud that's happened over the last 10, 15 years. But compound medications are medications that are not sold by the big pharmaceutical companies. They're formulas that pharmacists put together based on the input or direction of doctors. So for instance, somebody might not tolerate well a regular prescription drug, but if one or two ingredients were out of it, then they would be fine. So the doctor, signs a prescription, and a compounding pharmacy makes up this medication on their own. And it's loosely regulated, I guess, if at all, by the FDA. So once these became popular several years ago, it sort of became a bit of a Wild West. And what's interesting about the system that we had to understand early was the way that insurance companies pay for these things, the way they determine how much it is. One of the allegations in the case that the government kept saying was that the pharmacy charged a certain amount. Well, that's not exactly accurate, because what happens is these compounded medications are reimbursed by insurance companies based on the individual ingredients. So let's say ingredient 1 is reimbursed at, $500 a gram, ingredient 2 at $200 a gram, whatever it is. And when you combine all the ingredients into a medication, the insurance company gets the prescription, and they just do a calculation automatically that spits out how much they're going to pay for this medication. Well, for these compounds, which were used largely by people in the military, there were scar creams, pain creams, migraine things, and they were being reimbursed by insurance companies between $2,000 for a 1-month supply and $25,000 for a 1-month supply.
Wow.
And I would say the average, Caleb, you would remember this better than me, but I'd say between $5,000 and $15,000 was probably the average range of what these were reimbursed at by the insurance company.
Yep, it was right around there, and that wow that you just said, Ian, is really, I think, what led to the presumption of fraud as well. As soon as people heard the sticker price of a single month's prescription cost of $25,000, because and everyone always picked the highest paying one when they wanted to make the point that this is fraud. They'd always say, well, these are $26,000 each. But as soon as people see that and they hear, well, it's a cream for scars, there's an immediate assessment of the value of the product and saying it's not worth that amount, therefore it must be fraud. And so that was another thing that we were dealing with in the cases. And I think what got us to the place of everyone assuming it was fraud is, even though the pharmacy had no control over the price, people were patently offended by the price.
That's interesting. And you've got to feel that someone in the government was embarrassed that they were spending that amount.
That was certainly our one of the theories we had, one of the pitches we made, because see, private insurers paid for these medications. Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, others, they paid for these, as did TRICARE, which is the military insurance. But at some point around 2014, the private insurers stepped back and said, wait a minute, we're spending way too much. There's a couple of things wrong here. One, it can't be that all of these people need these medications. And they also said, this pricing system that we use is not legitimate either, because they all just relied on this national clearinghouse. The wholesalers report the prices, and that's what they reimbursed at. The private insurers stepped back and said, we shouldn't be doing this. And they cut their reimbursements drastically to what were really more reasonable prices. But the government insurer, the military insurance, TRICARE, went on for another year and a half paying top dollar that they didn't need to. And then when it finally got to the point where auditors said, inside the government said, you can't be doing this. What are you doing? It's bankrupting us. They said, okay, we're going to stop. Can't have any of these medications anymore. And by the way, let's put all these people in prison because a lot of this was illegal. So it was definitely a reaction on the part of the insurance company to say, wait a minute, we've been letting people do this for a long time. We need to stop it. And it's reactionary.
And they took the money that we were giving them, so we should put them in jail.
Correct. Now, to be clear, if people were paying illegal kickbacks and whatnot, absolutely, there's crimes and they should be prosecuted. But doesn't mean everybody was, which was their stance.
Yeah. And so obviously you brought that to the government before the trial. You said, hey, these were perfectly legal. I mean, you say that kind of stuff, and when you're in these federal cases, does the government go, oh yeah, oh you're right, we made a mistake? Do they ever do that?
Yeah, no, they don't. We met with prosecutors and agents a handful of times over the course of the 6 years, really, and 4.5 years, like Caleb said, before indictment. But we tried to get a sense of what they believed and what evidence they had. We countered it because, you don't go into a case, you go into a case planning for trial, but you don't go into a case necessarily wanting to go to trial or presuming you're going to go to trial. It's better for the client, obviously, if you can resolve it a lot earlier than that. So that was our goal, as it always is, to say, look, here's why you're wrong. Just look at this. So we did that. And of course, we got no relief whatsoever. We just got pushback. And, at that point, it became clear there was going to be a prosecution. But yes, we tried as hard as we could to say, look, you're wrong. You probably are right about some things. You're wrong about this. And they wouldn't listen, which is not a surprise. I mean, that's pretty much to be expected. Doesn't mean you quit trying.
And what the government would do too, because just to put this in perspective, over the course of the 2 years that kind of were at stake in the case where the pharmacy's operating, there was about 13,000 prescriptions that were filled. So it was a pretty substantial amount of medication that was dispensed from the pharmacy. And, if you think for 1 second that the federal prosecutor went through every prescription and figured out which ones were legitimate and which ones weren't, we're fooling ourselves. They had a couple of prescriptions that they would continuously point back to, and sometimes they weren't even correct in the assertions that they were making, but the government would, when we would try to say these prescriptions are valid, they're signed off on by a doctor, the pricing is approved by the contract, nothing was done untoward here on account of Greg Carter, the government would just say, well, but we've got, look at this one prescription that this is a problem, and basically if this one is bad, we know they're all dirty. And so it was kind of this lump everything in, all for one for all mentality that they had, which you really can't have in a case of this magnitude.
And what had happened? Over the course of the pharmacy marketing these prescriptions, Greg had hired somebody who came to him with a plan to more aggressively market compounds, especially not only, but especially to the military community. It's in Jacksonville, and to others. And that's what Greg would traditionally do, right? He would go market his services to doctors, to medical offices. Well, these folks came in and said, well, we can do that, and we can also market to patients, right? Just like the drug manufacturers do. If you watch any news program or a sports event, they're selling Keytruda and everything else. Well, that's what they were doing here on a small scale, marketing it to people, saying, hey, Ian, do you have this issue or that issue? I have a resource where you might be able to get help. You should go see your doctor and ask about this, or go see this particular doctor and ask about it. Where the problem came in is that some people had relationships with doctors, and doctors were behaving improperly, or the salesperson was actually paying a kickback to a patient and saying, if you get this prescription, I'll pay you $100, let's say, because I know that if I do that, I'm going to earn $2,000 on the sale, and I'll pay you 100 of it. And obviously that's illegal. But like Caleb was saying, just because that might have happened on the lowest level doesn't mean the people at the upper level know what's going on, even though they try to keep it under control and make sure it's not happening. So that's, once the government sees that this has happened and they have people telling them, I did this or I did that, they take it and extrapolate it all the way to the top and say, well, obviously everybody's in it together.
You can't know for certain that Greg didn't know, or can you?
Well,
no.
What Greg always told us is, I called the police and started this whole thing. Crooks don't do that. So, and he's not entirely wrong either. But really, to answer your question, can we know? No. And that's the terror that you have as a defense attorney going into trial, is you don't know what's out there that you don't know. But when our client is the one that called the cops on his employees for breaking the law, you've got a pretty good indication.
Yeah. And so trial, you're going into trial, like you said, you're nervous, you're just not sure what's going to happen. Was there a point where you're like, oh, this isn't going our way?
Really the whole trial unfolded just like we hoped it would and thought it might. All the things that we had been saying in negotiations for those 6.5 years had not changed by trial. The things that we said were holes in the government evidence remained holes at trial. The things that we knew we had on our side that they wouldn't listen to or believe came out our way at trial. All the testimony came out like we wanted it to, on both sides. The witnesses the government had, we saw who we thought their witnesses would be, and we said, well, these are not very strong witnesses against our client, against Greg. And you get to the testimony and you think, okay, well, what's going to happen that I'm not aware of? And turns out nothing happened. Now, the one thing that did happen at trial that was toward the end, and there was a lot of uncertainty, was that the person who was sort of the second in command at the pharmacy, she was in charge of operations essentially. And she had been a very cooperative person with us in several interviews during our investigation, insisted that she never did anything wrong and Greg never did anything wrong. And, said she was suspicious about some people, but they watched them like hawks as best they could, and there were no problems. Well, as the indictment comes out and we start getting discovery and evidence from the government, we find out that at some point she had decided to jump ship, and now she went to the government and was telling investigators the opposite of what she had been telling us for 4.5 years. But we saw what documentation she had provided, and it proved nothing. It was just a lot of hearsay from her that could be spun a number of different ways. And we didn't believe anything she said that was inculpatory of Greg at all. And then I'll let Caleb talk about what happened when she was supposed to be called as a witness at trial.
Yeah, she was the one wild card. But like Ron said, in her statements that she gave to law enforcement, they were all general. They were all, well, everybody knew everything that was going on. And so we really didn't know what specifics she was going to say. We didn't know if she was going to say, well, on May 19th of 2015, Greg got a call from so-and-so, and that person told Greg, I just paid this doctor. What do I do? That was the thing that we were afraid of. So she was the true wild card of what could this person possibly say? What could this person possibly make up? And there's, more things we can imagine she can make up that would be pretty believable in a fact pattern like we had. But we were a week into trial, a week and a half. This case is set for 5 weeks of trial, I believe it is.
Wow.
And the government's put on a whole lot of really nothing as far as Greg was concerned. And we're the only person we're waiting for is this one witness, this one right-hand woman. And the government says, well, they're planning on calling her the next day. This is a Tuesday, and the judge is making them say who their witnesses are for the next day, or something like that. And then I don't even remember how exactly it came out, but the prosecutor came over and says, well, we might have a problem with this witness. She thinks she might have COVID. and again, this is fall of 2021, kind of, when people were starting to be less concerned of the pandemic, but the Delta wave was really starting to get into full swing. So that was a reasonable possibility. We were all masked up the whole trial, so we were still taking COVID pretty seriously. And so at some point, the government attorney lets the judge know, well, Judge, we've got this issue. We really need this witness. We can go forward with these other witnesses. And so we finally get to the end of the line as far as who else do they have left. And all it is this one woman who's potentially going to say the most damaging things about our client. And now I want to say it's a Thursday, and the government files a motion, an ex parte motion that they weren't supposed to. Basically, they send an email to the judge, is kind of what it came down to, and didn't tell us about it, saying, well, Judge, she's got COVID, and we're having her go get a test. And then they finally bring us into the picture. And then we have a conversation with the judge and the prosecutor, and the judge says that she'll give the government the week, like give them Friday off and the weekend, and see if this person gets better. And I want to say Monday was even a holiday. And so we didn't come back to court until Tuesday. So we come back to court on Tuesday, and this is, this is the moment of truth for us. And we get a doctor's note that's provided, because the judge says, I want to see a doctor's note. I don't want this person's word. I want her to go down to a doctor, and I want that. And the government turns over the weekend, and we get it in court, and we have it in front of the judge, a doctor's note that says, patient test positive for COVID, and then the doctor's notes. Activity as tolerated for 10 days, parenthetical, no court, close parenthetical.
No court allowed.
and the judge says, I have to say, I have never seen a note from a doctor quite like this, but what are we going to do now? And at that point, after putting it off for about 4 or 5 days, the government just decided, I guess we won't be able to call her as a witness after all, which, we had our suspicions all along, whether she would show up as a witness based on all the contradictory statements she had made, because everything she might have testified to, we had our investigator there prepared to put him on the stand and say all the contradictions in the things that she had told him prior. So, the government didn't know what she had told us. She knew, and we believed all along that she was going to be very reticent to get up on the witness stand. So, did she have COVID? I don't know. Did she get a doctor to say she wasn't allowed to come to court? I don't know, but she never came to court.
The doctor's note, the famous doctor's note to not go to court.
My grandmother's sick, or my grandfather died, right? Yeah.
This is your fourth grandmother that died. How does that work, right?
Exactly.
You know what? In that moment, though, when the government said they weren't moving forward with her as a witness, I think that was the moment where we all took a big sigh of relief of, okay, we've seen everything that the government has, and they don't have anything. They literally do not have any evidence that Greg Carter did anything wrong. He's had to sit through this whole trial. But, the one wild card that they had never got dealt.
And
You know, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
go ahead. I was gonna say that it's what, after she didn't testify, that got to the point where we said, okay, well, really, almost nobody in this trial, no witness has said anything about Greg Carter. And that was only a step removed from another defendant in the trial who was represented by friends of yours, Vince Citro and Mark Horwitz, who I think his name was never mentioned by a witness in the entire trial. So even more dramatic than our client. I mean, it was to the point where every witness who testified, when it came time for cross-examination, Vince would just stand up and say, "We have no questions for this witness, Your Honor," because they had nothing to ask about because nobody ever mentioned their client's name.
It got to the point too where he would say it in a different way each time, and even the jury laughed, I think, at about the final time.
And, you know, and if you all haven't seen Vince's episode, you can go back and watch it. He tells some funny stories too. But okay, so you've got to be frustrated at this point. Or are you more frustrated or relieved? Because it's like, you can't be relieved and frustrated at the same time, can you? I don't know. Maybe you can.
Actually, I think you can. I think you can. I think it was relief that all the hard work we had put in and everything we believed and everything we had told our client came to pass, that we weren't surprised by anything, that we had gotten it right. We were relieved about that and happy about that, obviously. But at the same time, after we get past that point of saying, well, thank goodness we were right, we got this one right, then you look at each other and you say, the frustration comes out, because you say, why are we here? Why did we have to go through this? Yeah. Why did we take 6 years of our lives? And why did the client have to spend all this money on a defense if this is all there was? And so I think you can be frustrated and relieved at the same time.
And as crazy as it is, there's a third emotion going through of anxiety at the same time, because what we have talked about multiple times is that this dollar figure. So in this case, the pharmacy was what brought in over about a year and a half, $29 million.
Wow.
So and it went from making 2 or 3 million the year before to 29 million. So it was this dramatic scale up in income. And so we're relieved there's no evidence against our client. We're frustrated that we've told them this from the beginning. They're wasting, I don't know how many government dollars to put this trial on. But then you're anxious because you don't know, is the jury going to be able to get past that dollar figure? Are they going to see that and be taken in with the same sway that the government had of, this is just too much money, it's got to be fraud? And there's always a risk of that when you're dealing with a jury. You don't know what's going through their heads.
Yeah, there was an interesting question in jury selection that the judge asked that the defense side had proffered, and just so people understand, in state court, jury selection is way different from in federal court. In state court, each lawyer, one for the defense and one for the state, obviously, get to question the potential jurors before selecting the jury using the system that's in place. In federal court, very, very rarely does that happen. The judge asks questions to the judge's satisfaction, and we're allowed to submit questions that we want the judge to ask, but the judge asks what the judge wants to ask. And most of them they don't treat it with the same gravity that the lawyers do for whatever reason. And in this case, one of the questions we asked the judge to ask, and she surprisingly did, was, just because someone makes a lot of money in a short period of time, do you think that means something must be illegal about it? And it was a great question. I frankly don't think it was either of us that came up with that question. It was one of the other lawyers, but it was a brilliant question. We never thought the judge would ask it. She did. And that got us, I think, a long way when we saw the answers from people to to trying to defeat this idea that, well, there's a lot of money involved, so somebody's guilty of something.
Yeah. And so, yeah, because you're saying you've got this anxiety, and now the jury convenes and they go off to make their decision. What is that moment like? Because I always like talking about this, because it feels like it's one of those moments I feel like the only way you can feel it is if you've been involved in it. And I don't ever want to be involved in it. I don't think I'm going to go to law school, and hopefully I'm not ever have to hire you all. So I want to know, what does that feel like?
The anxiety is just, well, first of all, before you get to that moment, when the jury goes out, you have no idea how long they'll be out, right?
Mhm.
It could be half an hour. It could be an
Yeah.
hour. In a case like this, probably it's not going to be like that, because they heard a month of testimony, basically. But you retire to a room somewhere in the courthouse, and you've got all the defense lawyers sitting in the room talking, biting their fingernails. You've got, in our case, the clients joined, and a couple of their spouses, and there's they're even more anxious than we are, obviously, because it's them or their loved one. So you've got that period where you're sitting for hours, just killing time, wondering what's going to happen, trying not to discuss what you think's going to happen. Well, it should be this or it should be that. And then finally somebody says, just stop, because we're just killing ourselves wondering, when we have no idea what the jury's talking about. We can guess, but we really have no idea. So there's that whole part of it, which is difficult. And we waited over a weekend because the jury decided late on a Friday that they would take the weekend off and come back, not deliberate into the night and over the weekend. So that's sort of a double-edged sword too. They came back the next week, and it was pretty quick after that. But then there's the moment of being in court, which is what you might have been asking about, and just sitting there waiting for the judge to get it, and then to get the verdict, and then read it, and having all the jurors, looking at the defendants, the government, whoever they're looking at. The tension is so palpable, and the not a sound in the courtroom from anybody. It's I think you're right, Ian. You can't know what that feels like unless you feel it. I know Caleb had some particular emotions that he shared afterwards with us.
This was a case that had literally gone on longer than I had practiced law. It had gone on the entirety of my legal career, and then some.
That's crazy.
And so for me, I had lived this case. That first summer, when I was a first year law student, I spent every day 40 plus hours a week just poring over all of the different laws that could be at play, because we didn't know which ones. We didn't have the indictment. We just knew federal government, healthcare fraud, maybe it's a pharmacy. So I had lived this case for years and years and years. And so I had a lot invested. And when it comes to clients too, I care very, very deeply about my clients. So having lived this case, having it taken my entire career, caring for Greg becoming a friend throughout the course of this case, he's there now looking at the rest of his life in prison potentially. And I had sat through the whole trial. I knew there was no evidence that he did anything wrong. If they had convicted him, what I told Ron and the other lawyers there is, I said, if that jury comes back and convicts him, I'm quitting this line of work, and I will never do another criminal defense case. I refuse to be a part of injustice that goes on like this. And you know what? That was not hyperbole. I was not being dramatic. If that had happened, I would have handed Ron my 2-week notice and found a different place to work.
Wait, is that some reflection on me?
No, I don't think so. I think that's the system. So tell me about the verdict being read, because it wasn't just one person, right? It was a group of people.
Yeah, it was 4 defendants, and we were listed as the second defendant. So everything in trial started with the lead defendant, and then went down the line to the other 3, including the verdict. And the lead defendant was the head of the marketing business, essentially. It was the person that Greg had hired who brought in a lot of other people. And as the judge is reading the charges, he had four counts against him. Greg only had 3. But as the judge reads those, it was, help me out, Caleb, for him, not for Greg, guilty on conspiracy and guilty on money laundering, but not guilty on paying kickbacks or receiving kickbacks.
And that's important for a number of different reasons. Well, first, just as a emotional and as a tension reason, the very first count listed was conspiracy. Greg Carter was accused in that same conspiracy. So the very first verdict of the first charge came out as guilty. Oof. And so as soon as that happens, we don't know what that means. We don't know what that means for the rest of the counts, but your brain is immediately going a million miles an hour trying to think through all of the possible ways that this could go. With now, we know that the jury believes some people are guilty of criminal acts here in this courtroom.
Yeah, we know there's a
reason that.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, we know there's a conspiracy. We just don't know who the jury believes is in the conspiracy. If they had said not guilty, we'd have known that Greg was scot-free, that if they don't think there's any conspiracy, that we could just walk out right now. But seeing as they said, yes, this person is guilty of conspiracy, then we knew there was still a chance that Greg could get convicted.
Yeah. Oh,
and for the next 2 counts, one of the things that we haven't talked about, but was a reoccurring theme in this trial, is Greg Carter being conflated with the pharmacy itself as a corporate entity. And this gets a little hyper technical, but under the law, a corporate entity is considered a person. Now, obviously, a empty building can't do anything by itself. It can only act through people. But you can't just indict and convict a corporation and then throw the guy who owns the equity in the corporation in prison. But throughout the trial, that's kind of what the government was trying to do. They would just talk about Carter's Pharmacy, and it would be this broad term for everyone that worked at the pharmacy. But then they would use that and try to say that meant Greg Carter personally had done something bad. So it was this idea of he should be criminally responsible for everything that the pharmacy itself did. And the kickback counts that this lead defendant ended up being acquitted on were payments. They were his direct deposit salary payments from or wages from the company payroll, just ADP, which is a standard payroll system done by the bookkeeper straight to the lead defendant's bank account. So Greg Carter had nothing to do with it, but he was being charged with paying that kickback by the company actually paying the wages of each employee. So when count 2 came back of not guilty, we knew that the defense that we had said of these are just payments for salaries, these aren't kickbacks, we knew that was clearing Greg as far as the kickback counts,
which left just 2 charges against Greg, the money laundering and the conspiracy. So once the judge got through with the first defendant, got to us, and the most important one was the first one, conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. And so it's that moment that you're sitting there and you've got so many conflicting thoughts going through your brain, almost to the point that you can't think. You're just waiting to hear and hoping you hear it right. And as soon as she said not guilty, I think you felt our whole table, there were 4 of us sitting at the table, you felt our whole table just exhale, and everybody's sort of shoulders, relax a little bit, because we knew it was going to be not guilty on kickback, because if the other guy didn't receive a kickback, then Greg sure didn't pay a kickback. And if he's not guilty of conspiracy, not guilty of paying a kickback, then there's no way he can be guilty of an illegal monetary transaction either. So that first one, not guilty, we knew that was it. It was going to be not guilty across the board, but you still have to hear it. And then of course you hear it. And I don't know about Caleb, but I know what I did is first thing I did was glance over at the jury and see where they were looking. And they were, I think, pretty much all looking at Greg. And I thought, okay, they were here, they listened, they heard, and they believed us. So the moment of relief there is just, it's just hard to describe the burden that's lifted off your shoulders.
I can't imagine like 6.5 years of thinking about this, and now it's pretty much done. But it's not done though, is it? For like, it doesn't magically go away when you get that not guilty verdict.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. Well, and in this case, there were forfeiture counts too, where the government was attempting to take his house and a whole bunch of money that they had seized and had control of for the entire 6.5 years. We're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about a little over $6 million.
Wow.
That they had seized and was just sitting there. And so you wonder if they're going to do anything about that, but they had never filed a civil forfeiture. They just relied on criminal forfeiture, which criminal forfeiture means, okay, you're guilty of the crime. The forfeiture goes right along with it. The government gets the money. If they had filed a civil forfeiture claim, then they could have prosecuted that after the fact, but they had never filed it. They filed one against their home, and then they dropped that, after the not guilty, because there'd be not much good reason to proceed at that point with that one. So it's not over in that respect, but it's also not over in that you've got a guy with a local pharmacy, very successful. His father was the pharmacist and pharmacy owner since I want to say the 60s, Caleb, and 50s actually, yeah, in the neighborhood there. And Greg's not a pharmacist, but he owned the pharmacy, and his dad passed away during the course of this case.
Oh.
So what he had built was he kept the pharmacy operating, the mom and pop part of the pharmacy, with regular medications. The compounding stuff dried up, but he managed to keep a lot of the operation going out of the regular pharmacy, in terms of being able to make medications for people locally the doctors were prescribing. Even though the big dollars had dried up, he found a way to stay in it, keep the pharmacy running. But that's not often the case in these sorts of cases. I mean, you're talking about most companies being destroyed over the course of an investigation and a trial like this, even if there's an acquittal. But Greg was just that kind of a resilient guy that he kept the faith and kept it going. And I mean, he had to rebuild and is still rebuilding, but he wasn't going to let it drag him down.
Oh man.
And that's really a testament to Greg too, that the other thing, that it wasn't just about not letting it drag him down, is he felt responsible for the 25 employees that were still there at the pharmacy. They relied on him to keep it going to put food on their table and pay their rent. And that actually ended up being a pretty big part of our defense, is we brought his employees in to talk about the type of person he was. One of the things that we got out in evidence was that one of his employees needed a new roof, couldn't afford a new roof on her house. So Greg just paid for the whole new roof for her because he knew she couldn't afford it and he could. So he did. And that's the type of resilience and tenacity that Greg had to basically keep providing for all of these families in the midst of facing the rest of his life in prison.
And, we talked earlier, Caleb mentions that story, and it came out at trial, but we had talked earlier about the government finding a way to look at something and make it fit into their narrative. And this is one of those things, because when we said, we're calling these people as employees, or the employees as witnesses, and that's the thing we talk about, they put this spin on it, like, Well, he did that sort of thing essentially as a bribe to get these people to say nice things about him.
Oh,
Right. And it's like, no, he did it because he's a good person, but it doesn't matter because they know he's guilty. And there's got to be a different reason he did it, not because he cared about the people. So that's one example of the way a fact that you think is good for a defendant gets turned on its head by a prosecutor or an agent, whoever it might be.
wow. Wow. I mean, it's just a crazy story, but it shows also how important it is to have quality law firms defending you. And I mean, all in all, how many hours of work did you all put into this to make sure?
Wow. Well, we could tell you. Caleb probably can look it up right now and get you a number, but and over the course of the time, there were a couple other people involved, even with our defense, for small pieces of it along the way. But there were times, and I don't mean just going to trial, there were weeks where it was pretty much consuming. I figured at one point as we were planning for trial that for about a year, it would take as much as 50% of my time.
Wow.
And that was just me individually. Caleb was I think in a similar position. So, some weeks it was almost 100%, some weeks maybe 20%. But overall, a big piece of what we do. But again, one of the hard things to reconcile about the criminal justice system is that this is a client who had the resources to be able to hire lawyers who could spend that kind of time and put in that kind of effort. The large majority of defendants just don't have that ability. And it's a patently unfair part of the criminal justice system, but it's one that I don't really see a solution to. We have our clients, we take care of our clients, and it's just impossible for everybody to receive the same attention because of the economics of it.
Yeah, it's disheartening. It's scary too. It's scary that you can be doing the right thing the whole way, and if the federal government decides that you're not, there's not a whole lot you can do about it.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. Oh. And I did look up how much time we put in, and this is a best guess because we actually switch systems halfway through the case. When a case goes on 6.5 years, you switch into a bunch of different systems. But it looks like we spent over 6.5 years between the two of us, almost 4,000 hours.
Wow.
Yeah.
4,000 hours. That's a lot. That's a lot of time.
That's
more than a couple seasons of Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see why we're so invested in the result when you put that much of your heart and soul into your job. It's not really putting it into the job, it's putting it into the people, or the person you're working with. And this is a case where we had a client who we really believed in and really believed that that he was worth all the blood, sweat, and tears that it took. So it's gratifying. It's really gratifying at the end to see it work out. It doesn't always happen that way.
No, but I mean, obviously you put hard work into it and did what you could, and it came out well. And you're a hardworking attorney. So if someone does need a lawyer, tell us a little bit more about the types of law that you all practice. I mean, it's mainly criminal defense, and throughout the state of Florida, federal criminal defense, but also you do some other types of law as well, correct?
We do federal and state defense. There's three of us, along with Peg O'Connor, who practice daily. Larry Turner, who is our senior partner, is of counsel now. He's on the retirement train right now. So three of us who run the practice, and the large majority of our work is criminal defense, state and federal, but also we work with professionals, and I say we work with professionals. That's in licensing issues. We're in Gainesville, so University of Florida is there, and there's a lot of things happening at the university where employees and faculty and students, in a lot of cases, need help with various either employment issues or disciplinary issues. So we work with those folks too. We assist everybody from doctors, lawyers, judges, all sorts of professionals who have professional issues, be it licensing or some other variation of that. So that's the other largest part of our work.
Awesome. Well, hopefully not many of you are listening to this need their help, but obviously they're amazing attorneys and they work hard and they're great people. So go to Turner, O'Connor, Kozlowski. We'll put the link in the show notes. You can Google that, or it's the website. I should know that is TOK. Is it TOK Law?
TOK Legal. TOK
Legal.
TOKlegal.com, but you can actually get there a couple different ways, but that's the primary way.
Yes, TOKlegal.com is the links. And where do you all spend any time on social media? Can anyone follow you on the socials?
I think we're both on LinkedIn. Yeah.
All right. So we'll put links to both your LinkedIn on there. Well, Caleb, Ron, thank you so much for being on True Law Stories. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ian. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
That was a lot.
Thanks for having us, Ian.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And thanks for telling that story. And thank you all for listening to Ron, Caleb tell this crazy story. Make sure to check out their website, connect with them on LinkedIn if it's relevant, or if it's not, just say hi, say you heard them here. But thank you all for taking us on your journey. This has been Ian Garlic and True Law Stories.